Imagine walking from London to Amsterdam, not flying over the ocean, not taking a ferry, just walking. Through rolling hills covered in oak and hazel forests, past rivers teeming with salmon, across plains where herds of deer, greys and aurochs roam. You stop at a freshwater lake to fill your water skin, and in the distance you see smoke rising from a settlement, a small group of families living in wooden shelters, fishing, hunting, surviving. This isn't science fiction. This was real. For thousands of years you could have made this journey on foot because there was no North Sea, not the way we know it today. Between Britain and Europe there was land, hundreds of miles of it, a whole world with its own ecosystems, its own seasons, its own human cultures. Scientists call it Doggerland, and it was home to thousands of people before it vanished beneath the waves. Today, if you look at a map of Europe, Britain is an island. It's separated from the continent by the North Sea and the English Channel. We think of this as permanent, as if it's always been this way. But 10,000 years ago that map would look completely different. Where we now see cold, grey water stretching between England and the Netherlands, there was a landscape as rich and varied as anywhere else in prehistoric Europe. Doggerland wasn't some barren wasteland waiting to be drowned. It was a paradise for Stone Age hunter-gatherers, the heartland of Northern Europe, possibly more important than the lands we now call Britain or Denmark or the Netherlands. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make it. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments, and it's like Tokyo at dawn, Toronto at midnight, all at once. For most of human history, nobody knew Doggerland existed. It disappeared so completely that it left almost no trace in human memory. No myths, no legends, no stories passed down through generations about the drowned lands. The people who lived there didn't have writing. When their world slowly sank beneath the rising seas, their stories sank with it. For 8,000 years, Doggerland was simply gone, erased from history, a ghost landscape hidden under hundreds of feet of cold water. But here's what makes this story so haunting. This wasn't ancient history when Doggerland drowned. This was happening at the same time humans were building the first permanent settlements in the Middle East. At the same time agriculture was being invented in the Fertile Crescent. While some humans were taking the first steps towards civilization in the south, their cousins in the north were watching their entire world disappear beneath the waves, generation by generation, the land shrinking, the seas rising, communities being forced to migrate or drown. And they had no idea why it was happening. They didn't understand climate change or glacial melt or sea level rise. They just knew that the world their grandparents described, with its vast hunting grounds and rich river valleys, was vanishing. The places where they'd buried their dead were being swallowed by the sea. The camps where they'd spent countless summers were flooding, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. What we're going to explore in this story is something rare in history, a complete world, lost and then found again. We'll walk through Doggerland's forests and marshes. We'll meet the animals that lived there, from woolly mammoths in its earliest days to the red deer and wild boar that roamed its final centuries. We'll discover how Mesolithic people survived and thrived in this landscape, what they ate, how they lived, what tools they made, how they raised their children. We'll watch as the climate warmed at the end of the Ice Age and the seas began their slow, inexorable rise. We'll see how communities adapted, how they kept moving north and west as the water claimed more land. And we'll witness the final catastrophe, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway that triggered a tsunami, potentially drowning what remained of Doggerland in a matter of hours. But this isn't just a story about loss. It's a story about resilience. The people of Doggerland didn't vanish when the world drowned. They became the ancestors of the people who settled Britain, who built Stonehenge, who eventually formed the cultures and nations we know today. Their DNA flows in the veins of millions of modern Europeans. Their story is our story. So settle in, get comfortable. We're about to journey to a world that exists now only in sediment cores and sonar scans, in fragments of bone and stone dredged up by fishing nets, in the computer models of archaeologists who've spent decades piecing together this lost landscape. We're going beneath the waves to find the lost humans of Doggerland. Picture this. It's 1931. You're Captain Pilgrim Lockwood, and you're hauling in your trawl nets off the Norfolk coast, about 25 miles from shore. The Dogger Bank fishing grounds. Same place you've been fishing for 30 years. Same backbreak in work, same endless hours sorting through whatever the North Sea decides to give up. Most days it's fish. Sometimes it's rocks. Occasionally it's something weird. Bones too big to belong to anything living in modern seas. Chunks of fossilized wood. Once in a while, stones that look almost like they've been shaped by human hands. But today you pull up something different. It's about 4 inches long, dark brown, almost black from millennia underwater. One end is pointed and barbed. The other end shows clear signs of having been attached to something, maybe a wooden shaft, and running along its length are deliberate, carefully carved grooves. This isn't natural. This isn't an accident of erosion or water damage. This is a tool, a weapon, a harpoon point carved from red deer antler by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Captain Lockwood doesn't know it yet, but he's just found physical proof of something that will change how we understand the entire geography of prehistoric Europe. He's found evidence of Doggerland, the drowned world between Britain and continental Europe, a landscape that vanished beneath the waves 8,000 years ago, taking with it an entire way of life, an entire civilization of hunter-gatherers who lived, thrived and died in a land that no longer exists. But here's the thing. Captain Lockwood's discovery wasn't unusual. It was just the first one that somebody bothered to save and send to a museum. North Sea fishermen had been hauling up impossible things for generations. Mammoth bones, mastodon teeth, the fossilized remains of lions, wolves and rhinoceroses, species that hadn't lived in Britain in thousands of years, coming up from fishing grounds that were supposed to be nothing but mud and sand. The fishermen knew something was down there. They just didn't know what. Some thought they were finding remains from the biblical flood. Others figured they were dredging up material that had somehow washed out from the British coast. A few speculated about ancient land bridges, but mostly they just tossed the weird stuff back and kept the fish, because bones and stones don't pay the bills. But that harpoon point, the one Captain Lockwood found, it ended up in Norwich Castle Museum, and eventually it caught the attention of archaeologists who realized they were looking at something extraordinary. This wasn't just any prehistoric artifact. The style, the craftsmanship, the material, it all dated to the Mesolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 years ago. But it had been found 25 miles offshore, in water that was over 100 feet deep. Unless prehistoric humans were fishing from submarines, there was only one explanation. That harpoon point hadn't been dropped into the sea. It had been made and used on dry land that was now underwater. The implications were staggering. If there had been dry land where the North Sea now exists, if people had lived there, hunted there, created communities there, then everything we thought we knew about prehistoric Britain and Europe needed to be reconsidered. This wasn't just an interesting footnote. This was a missing chapter in human history. But the archaeological community was skeptical. Because here's the problem. We humans are terrible at accepting evidence that contradicts our existing mental maps. For centuries, everyone had assumed that Britain had always been an island, separated from Europe by the North Sea and the English Channel. Sure, there might have been temporary land bridges during ice ages when sea levels dropped, but a permanent, inhabited landscape. That seemed like fantasy. The skeptics had reasonable objections. Where were the settlements? Where were the burial sites? Where was all the other archaeological evidence you'd expect from a populated region? One harpoon point wasn't enough. It could be an outlier, an artifact carried by currents from somewhere else. Maybe it had fallen off a boat. Maybe it was misidentified. The burden of proof was enormous. So the idea sat there, intriguing but unproven. For decades, Doggerland remained a fringe theory, something mentioned occasionally in archaeological papers but never seriously investigated. Because how do you excavate the bottom of the North Sea? How do you prove the existence of a landscape that's been underwater for 8,000 years? Then marine geology caught up with the mystery. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, oil and gas companies began doing detailed seafloor mapping of the North Sea. They weren't looking for archaeology. They were looking for drilling sites. But what they found was impossible to ignore. The North Sea floor wasn't flat. It wasn't the featureless mud basin everyone had assumed. It was full of structure, ridges and valleys, channels that looked exactly like river systems, raised areas that could only be hills or elevated plains. And when geologists started analysing the sediment cores, they found something even more remarkable. Layers of peat, thick deposits of compressed vegetation that could only form in freshwater marshes or wetlands. Peat doesn't form underwater in the ocean. It forms on land, in bogs, in marshes, in river deltas. Which meant that at some point, large areas of the North Sea had been dry enough, stable enough, wet enough to support the kind of vegetation that creates peat. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was hard geological evidence. There had been land here, lots of it. The data started attracting attention from academics who realized they were sitting on the archaeological discovery of the century. And that's where Professor Vince Gaffney and his team from the University of Bradford enter the story. In the mid-2000s, Gaffney convinced oil and gas companies to share their seafloor mapping data for archaeological analysis. Thousands of square kilometers of detailed seismic scans showing the structure of sediment layers beneath the North Sea. What Gaffney's team did next was revolutionary. They used that geological data to reconstruct the landscape of Doggerland as it had existed before the flooding. By identifying buried river channels, they could trace ancient waterways. By mapping elevated areas, they could locate hills and ridges. By analysing sediment types, they could distinguish between coastal zones, river valleys, and inland plains. Computer algorithms pieced together this scattered data into something extraordinary. A map. An actual detailed map of a landscape that hadn't been seen by human eyes in 8,000 years. And it wasn't just any landscape. What emerged from the data was a vast, low-lying plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, a region that would have been larger than many modern European countries. The terrain was diverse. Rolling hills in some areas, flat plains in others, vast river systems cutting through the landscape, and extensive wetlands along what would have been the coastlines. This wasn't a narrow land bridge, this was a country, a rich, diverse, habitable landscape that would have been absolutely prime territory for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Gaffney called it Britain's lost Atlantis, and the name stuck. Except unlike Atlantis, this wasn't mythology. This was real. The geological evidence was undeniable, and once you knew what to look for, evidence of Doggerland's human inhabitants started showing up everywhere. Fishermen who had been tossing mammoth bones and weird stones back into the sea for generations suddenly found museums interested in their catches. Collections of North Sea artifacts began accumulating. More bone tools, stone axes, flint blades and scrapers, antler hammers used for working flint. Every new find added detail to the picture of who had lived in Doggerland and how they'd survived. The most systematic collection effort came from Dutch waters, where dredging operations for coastal construction regularly churned up prehistoric material. In 2019, a team of archaeologists working with Dutch marine contractors recovered thousands of flint tools, along with bone fragments from aurochs, red deer, and wild horses, all species that would have been hunted by Mesolithic humans. The concentration of finds suggested they weren't random. These tools were coming from specific locations on the seafloor, locations that had probably been settlement sites or hunting camps 10,000 years ago. One of the most remarkable finds was a fragment of a Neanderthal skull, pulled up from the seafloor off the Dutch coast. DNA analysis confirmed it was about 40,000 years old, proving that human habitation of Doggerland went back far earlier than the Mesolithic period. Neanderthals had walked this land. They'd hunted here, lived here, died here, and then their descendants, modern humans, had done the same for thousands of years after. But here's what makes the discovery of Doggerland so profound. It's not just about finding a lost landscape. It's about realizing how much of human history has been hidden from us by rising seas. How many settlements have been drowned? How many migration routes are now underwater? How many cultural developments happened in regions that no longer exist? Think about it this way. If you're an archaeologist studying prehistoric Europe, you've been working with only part of the evidence. You've been examining sites in Britain, sites in France, Germany, the Netherlands, all the places that are still above water, and you've been trying to figure out how these populations interacted, how technologies spread, how people moved across the landscape. But you've been missing the middle, the heart of the region, the central lowland plain that connected everything. It's like trying to understand the history of the Mediterranean world while ignoring Italy, or studying North American prehistory while pretending the Great Plains don't exist. You might come up with theories that sort of work, but you're missing the most important part of the story. Doggerland was that missing piece. It was the cultural and geographical centre of northwestern Europe for thousands of years. And we only rediscovered it because fishermen kept hauling up bones, and archaeologists finally started paying attention. The technology that made this discovery possible has continued to advance. Modern multi-beam sonar can now map the seafloor with incredible precision, revealing details as small as a few meters across. Ground-penetrating radar adapted for underwater use can identify buried structures beneath layers of marine sediment. And most recently, researchers have begun using DNA analysis on sediment cores pulled from the North Sea. Turns out that soil preserves genetic material from plants and animals for thousands of years. By analysing ancient DNA from Doggerland sediments, scientists can reconstruct the ecosystems that existed there. What plants grew? What animals lived there? How did the environment change over time? The answers are astonishing. The DNA evidence shows Doggerland wasn't some marginal, barely habitable wasteland. It was an ecological paradise, temperate forests rich with game, extensive wetlands full of fish and waterfowl, grasslands supporting herds of aurochs and wild horses. This was some of the best hunting territory in all of prehistoric Europe, and climate change research has brought new urgency to understanding Doggerland. Because what happened there 8,000 years ago is happening again now. Sea levels are rising, coastal regions are flooding, islands are disappearing. Within a few centuries, large parts of our current coastline will be underwater, just like Doggerland. By studying how Mesolithic people adapted to rising seas, how they responded to the gradual drowning of their homeland, we might learn something about our own future. Did they retreat gradually? Did they resist the change? At what point did they abandon their settlements and migrate to higher ground? The archaeological record of Doggerland holds clues to how humans respond to catastrophic environmental change, lessons that might prove essential as we face our own climate crisis. But there's something else too, something more fundamental. The discovery of Doggerland reminds us how contingent human history really is, how much of what we think of as permanent, Britain being an island, the geography of Europe, the shape of our coastlines, is actually temporary. The world looked completely different 10,000 years ago. It'll look completely different 10,000 years from now. The people who lived in Doggerland didn't know they were living on borrowed time. They built communities, raised children, developed traditions, created the kind of deep cultural knowledge that takes generations to accumulate, and then the sea rose, and all of it vanished. Not violently, not suddenly, but slowly, inexorably, year by year, until finally there was nothing left but stories, and eventually not even that, just bones and stones sleeping beneath the waves, waiting for a fisherman's net to drag them back into the light. And now we know they were there. Now we can map their world, reconstruct their environment, understand how they lived, all because someone paid attention to what the sea was giving back. Now imagine standing on what is today the seafloor of the North Sea, except you're not underwater. You're standing on solid ground, dry earth beneath your feet, with grass stretching to the horizon in every direction. It's around 10,000 BCE. The ice sheets have been retreating for a few thousand years now, and the world is warming, slowly transforming from the frozen wasteland of the last glacial maximum into something more hospitable, more alive. You're standing in Doggerland, and it's massive. Here's what most people don't grasp when they first hear about this place. Doggerland wasn't some little strip of land connecting Britain to Europe. It wasn't a bridge you could walk across in a day or two. This was a country, a whole landscape roughly the size of modern Britain itself, stretching from what's now the east coast of England all the way to the Netherlands, Denmark and Germany. If you were standing in the middle of it, you couldn't see the sea in any direction. Just land rolling on, broken by rivers and forests and hills. Britain wasn't an island then. That's the thing that rewrites everything we think about British history. Britain was just the western highlands of a much larger territory. The high ground. If you were a Mesolithic hunter standing in what is now Norfolk, you wouldn't think of yourself as being on an island. You'd think of yourself as being in the western hills of a vast plain that stretched east for hundreds of miles. The North Sea didn't exist as we know it. Instead, there was Doggerland, named centuries later after the Dogger Bank, that shallow area where fishing trawlers kept pulling up evidence of this drowned world. But 12,000 years ago, the Dogger Bank wasn't a bank at all. It was hills, gentle slopes rising from the surrounding lowlands, probably covered in birch and pine, probably dotted with lakes fed by springs and seasonal streams. The landscape was constantly changing. Not over decades, but you could see it shift if you lived your whole life there. This was the early Holocene, the warming period after the Ice Age, and everything was in flux. Year by year, the ice sheets to the north were melting, releasing unimaginable volumes of fresh water into the ocean. But that water hadn't reached Doggerland yet. Not in force, not enough to drown it. For now, it just meant more rain, fuller rivers, expanding forests where tundra had been. The rivers. God, the rivers of Doggerland must have been something to see. Take the Thames. Today it's a relatively modest river that flows through London and empties into the North Sea. Back then, the Thames didn't end at London. It kept going, flowing northeast across what's now the seafloor, joined by other rivers draining from the hills of Britain. The Rhine was doing the same thing from the east, gathering water from the mountains of Central Europe, flowing west and north across the plain. Somewhere in the middle of Doggerland, these massive river systems came together, merging into a single enormous waterway that has been called the Channel River, or sometimes the Fleuve Manche. This wasn't some modest stream. This was one of the largest river systems in Europe, draining half a continent, carrying meltwater from the retreating glaciers, sediment from erosion, nutrients that fed the richest ecosystem on the continent. The valley this river carved would have been miles wide in places, its floodplain spreading out during spring floods, creating vast wetlands that dried to meadows in summer. And it wasn't alone. Dozens of smaller rivers crisscrossed the plain, fed by rainfall and springs and the slow release of water from thawing ground. Archaeological evidence from the seafloor shows ancient river channels running in every direction, creating a network of waterways that would have been natural highways for the people living there. You could travel hundreds of miles by boat, from the hills of Britain to the forests of northern Europe, never needing to portage more than a few miles between river systems. The terrain was incredibly diverse. That's what makes Doggerland so different from the cold, uniform sea that covers it now. The North Sea is basically flat, a shallow continental shelf with minimal variation. But Doggerland was anything but uniform. In the north, near what's now the coast of Scotland and Norway, there were marshlands, extensive wetlands where fresh water from rivers mixed with seasonal flooding, creating a maze of channels and islands and reed beds that probably looked like the Okavango Delta or the Everglades. These marshlands would have been incredibly rich in birds, fish, seasonal plants, a paradise for hunters who knew how to navigate them. Moving south and east, the land rose into rolling hills, not mountains, nothing dramatic, but gentle slopes covered in grassland and scattered trees. In the early post-glacial period, this would have been mostly open terrain, tundra vegetation giving way to grass and low shrubs. But as the climate warmed, forests began advancing from the south. Birch trees first, those hardy pioneers that can tolerate almost anything. Then pine, spreading from refuges where they'd survived the Ice Age. Then hazel, bringing its nutritious nuts that would become a staple food for Doggerland's inhabitants. By 10,000 BCE, much of the southern part of Doggerland would have been transitioning from open grassland to mixed woodland. Not dense forest yet, but a mosaic of trees and clearings, groves, separated by meadows, the kind of landscape ecologists call wood pasture. This is prime territory for large mammals. Deer thrive in these conditions. Wild cattle, the massive aurochs that stood 6 feet at the shoulder, elk that could weigh 1,500 pounds, all grazing on the rich grass and browsing the young trees. The western edge of Doggerland, where it met the hills of what would become Britain, was probably the most heavily forested. Higher elevation meant more rainfall, and the hills would have caught weather systems coming from the Atlantic. Dense pine forests on the slopes, giving way to birch and eventually oak as you moved into the lowlands, and everywhere, water. That's what made Doggerland special. This wasn't a desert plain or a frozen wasteland. This was a land of lakes and lagoons, of marshes and meandering rivers, of coastlines that shifted with the seasons. The lake systems alone would have been extraordinary. As the ice sheets melted, they left behind a landscape pockmarked with depressions, hollows scraped out by glaciers or filled by meltwater. These became lakes, some of them substantial. Core samples from the seafloor have found evidence of what might have been freshwater lakes tens of miles across, their shores lined with birch trees, their waters probably filled with pike and perch and waterfowl. Some of these lakes were permanent, fed by springs and rivers, lasting for thousands of years. Others were seasonal, filling during wet periods and becoming marshes or even dry meadows during droughts. This kind of dynamic landscape creates incredible ecological diversity. Different habitats appearing and disappearing with the seasons, creating opportunities for specialists and generalists alike. The lagoons were another crucial feature. As sea levels slowly rose throughout this period, saltwater began intruding along the coastlines of Doggerland. But it didn't advance uniformly. Instead, it created brackish lagoons, areas where fresh water from rivers mixed with saltwater from the advancing sea. These lagoons would have been phenomenally productive, shellfish beds providing reliable protein, fish runs as marine species moved into fresh water to spawn, vast flocks of migratory birds using the lagoons as stopover points. The coastlines themselves were constantly shifting. Not dramatically, not in ways you'd notice year to year, but over generations the sea was advancing. At first, during the coldest parts of the Ice Age, Doggerland's coastline extended far beyond where it would later be. The North Sea was almost entirely dry land, but as temperatures rose and ice melted, the sea began its slow return. By 10,000 BCE, Doggerland's northern edge was already retreating. The sea was flooding into the low areas between Britain and Scandinavia, creating narrow straits that would eventually widen into the North Sea. But the main body of Doggerland was still high and dry, still habitable, still prime territory. The southern coast was more stable, protected by higher ground. Where Doggerland met what would become the English Channel, there were probably rocky shores and cliffs, not unlike the white cliffs that now mark Dover. This was the edge of the Dogger Hills, the high ground that would be the last part of Doggerland to survive the flooding. Think about what this landscape must have looked like to someone actually living there. If you were a Mesolithic hunter, maybe 25 years old, born in a camp near one of those massive rivers, this was your entire world. You'd know every grove of hazel trees within a day's walk. You'd know which lakes froze in winter and which stayed open. You'd know where the deer gathered in autumn and where the aurochs came to drink in summer. You could travel for weeks in any direction and still be in familiar territory, meeting other groups who spoke your language, who shared your customs, who were probably related to you by blood or marriage. East toward the Rhine, you'd find forests that grew denser and darker. West toward the hills of Britain, the land rose and the trees changed. North toward the marshes, the ground became soft and treacherous, but also rich with birds and fish. South toward the high ground, you'd find better flint for tools, clearer streams, drier campsites. The seasonal changes would have dominated your life. Spring meant flooding as meltwater and rain swelled the rivers. The massive floodplains of the Channel River would become inland seas, forcing you to higher ground, but also bringing fish into shallow waters where they could be trapped and speared. Summer meant abundance, animals migrating north to take advantage of the long days and fresh grass, plant foods ripening, time to smoke meat and gather nuts for the winter ahead. Autumn brought the reverse migration, herds moving south again as the days shortened. This was prime hunting season. Animals were fat from summer grazing, their hides perfect for clothing, their meat ideal for preservation. Winter was harder. The rivers might freeze, though not as severely as they had during the Ice Age. Game became scarce as animals holed up or moved to sheltered valleys. This was when those stored nuts and dried fish meant survival or starvation. And through all of this, the landscape was slowly, inexorably changing. Each generation saw the rivers run a bit fuller. Each generation noticed the sea had advanced a little closer. The old camping sites their grandparents talked about, the ones near the northern coast, those were gone now, claimed by rising water. New lagoons were forming where there had been freshwater lakes. The marshlands were expanding, but it was slow enough that no single generation would have thought of it as catastrophic. The land was still vast, still rich, still home. They had no way of knowing they were living in a world that was already doomed, that the ice sheets melting in the far north were sealing their fate, that, in just a few thousand years, this entire landscape, this country the size of Britain, would be completely submerged beneath a cold grey sea. For now, in 10,000 BCE, Doggerland was still the heartland, still the centre of the world for the people who called it home. A vast, diverse, endlessly fascinating landscape that supported human communities for thousands of years. A lost world that was once as real and solid as the ground beneath your feet right now. Picture the landscape we just described. Vast plains stretching from what's now Yorkshire to Denmark, rivers cutting through forests of pine and birch, wetlands teeming with life. And now fill that landscape with animals. Not just any animals, but an ecosystem so rich, so abundant, that it would make modern nature documentaries look empty by comparison. Because here's the thing about Doggerland. It wasn't just a land bridge. It was one of the most productive hunting grounds in human history. A landscape caught in transition between two worlds, the dying Ice Age and the rising warmth of the Holocene. And that transition created something extraordinary, a biological paradise where cold-adapted megafauna still clung to survival, while warm-weather species were moving in to claim their territory. For several thousand years, both groups existed side by side, creating an ecosystem unlike anything we see today. Start with the giants, the species that defined the Ice Age, the animals that would have seemed impossible if we didn't have their bones to prove they existed. Woolly mammoths still walked the Doggerland plain during the earliest periods of human habitation. Not the massive populations that had dominated the landscape during the height of the glaciation, but remnant groups, holdouts, in an increasingly warming world. These weren't the enormous mammoths of Siberia, but slightly smaller populations that had adapted to life in more temperate conditions. They would have been concentrated in the northern reaches of Doggerland, where temperatures stayed coolest longest. Imagine spotting a small herd from a distance, maybe 5 or 6 individuals, their dark shapes moving slowly across the grassland. Adult females protecting calves, a massive bull standing guard. For the human hunters who encountered them, these animals represented an almost unimaginable resource. A single mammoth could provide several tons of meat, enough to feed a band of 30 people for weeks. Their thick hides made excellent shelter material. Their bones could be used for tools and structural supports. Their tusks were valuable trade goods and raw material for crafted objects. But hunting them was incredibly dangerous. Mammoths weren't passive victims. They were intelligent, social animals that defended themselves and their young aggressively. Archaeological evidence from other sites shows that mammoth hunting required sophisticated planning, coordinated group action, and weapons capable of inflicting serious damage from a distance. Many hunters probably died in failed mammoth hunts, but the rewards for success were so great that the risk was worth taking. Alongside the mammoths, woolly rhinoceros grazed the grasslands. These animals were even more formidable than mammoths, solitary, bad-tempered, armed with massive horns that could disembowel a hunter with a single thrust. Rhinos probably weren't hunted systematically. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. But when opportunity presented itself, a sick animal, an old bull separated from better feeding grounds, hunters would take the chance. Rhino bones have been found in the North Sea showing clear evidence of human modification, proof that Doggerland's people weren't afraid to tackle even the most dangerous prey. Then there were the giant elk, called megaloceros by scientists. These animals were absolutely spectacular. Bulls carried antlers that could span 12 feet from tip to tip, the largest antlers of any deer species that ever lived. They were massive creatures standing over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing close to 1,500 pounds. Unlike mammoths and rhinos, giant elk were relatively abundant in Doggerland, at least during the earlier periods. They preferred the transition zones between forest and grassland, exactly the kind of mixed habitat that Doggerland provided in abundance. For hunters, giant elk represented an ideal prey species, large enough to provide substantial resources but not so dangerous that hunting them meant risking your life. They were herd animals, which meant if you found one you'd likely find more, and their predictable seasonal movements made them easier to locate and hunt systematically. But as the centuries passed and temperatures continued rising, these Ice Age giants began disappearing. Not all at once, not everywhere simultaneously, but slowly, population by population. By around 8,500 years ago, the mammoths were gone from Doggerland entirely. The rhinos vanished around the same time. Giant elk held on longer in some areas, but eventually succumbed to the warming climate and shrinking grasslands they needed to survive. As the old giants faded, new species moved in to replace them. Red deer became increasingly common, smaller than giant elk but better adapted to the expanding forests. These animals thrived in Doggerland's changing landscape. Archaeological sites from the later periods of occupation show that red deer became the primary large game species, their bones showing up in almost every settlement context. Red deer are smart, adaptive animals. They learned quickly where human settlements were located and adjusted their behavior accordingly. This created an evolutionary arms race between hunters and prey. Deer becoming more cautious, more selective about where they grazed and watered. Hunters developing better tracking skills, more sophisticated hunting techniques, improved projectile weapons. Roe deer spread across the landscape too, smaller and more elusive than red deer, but abundant enough that they became an important food source. They preferred dense forest undergrowth, the kind of habitat that was expanding as Doggerland's climate warmed. Hunting them required different skills than pursuing larger game, stealth rather than strength, individual stalking rather than coordinated group drives. But perhaps the most important new arrival was the wild boar. These animals are the ancestors of domestic pigs, but don't let that fool you into thinking they were docile. Wild boars are aggressive, dangerous animals when cornered. Males can weigh 400 pounds or more, armed with tusks capable of inflicting terrible injuries. They're also incredibly intelligent and adaptable, capable of eating almost anything, thriving in almost any habitat with adequate cover. For Doggerland's inhabitants, boars represented both opportunity and challenge. The meat was excellent, the fat rendered into valuable cooking and lamp oil. Boar hide was thick and durable, perfect for certain kinds of clothing and containers. But hunting them was risky work. Wounded boars were notorious for charging their attackers, and their thick hide made them difficult to kill cleanly with the weapons available at the time. Then there were the aurochs, wild cattle that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder with enormous forward-curving horns. These animals were the ancestors of modern domesticated cattle, but they were far more formidable. Bulls were aggressive and territorial, especially during breeding season. They lived in small herds in the forest clearings and grasslands, browsers and grazers that could thrive in the mixed habitats Doggerland provided. Hunting aurochs required careful planning. You didn't just stumble across a bull and decide to take it down. You scouted herds, identified vulnerable individuals, planned escape routes in case things went wrong. The archaeological record shows aurochs' bones at numerous Doggerland-related sites, proof that despite the danger, hunters successfully targeted these animals regularly. But Doggerland wasn't just about prey animals. Where herbivores thrive, predators follow. Wolves roamed the landscape in packs, competing with human hunters for the same prey species. These weren't the depleted, isolated wolf populations of modern Europe. These were robust, widespread populations that played a crucial role in the ecosystem. They culled sick and weak animals, controlled herbivore populations, and scavenged carrion that might otherwise spread disease. Humans and wolves had a complicated relationship. Competition certainly, both species targeting the same prey. Conflict occasionally, especially if wolves began taking human kills or threatening human settlements, but also perhaps the beginnings of cooperation. Some researchers think the human-dog relationship began in exactly these kinds of contexts. Wolves hanging around human camps, feeding on scraps, gradually becoming habituated to human presence. Over generations, the boldest, friendliest individuals would have had better access to human food resources, creating selection pressure for domestication. Brown bears lumbered through Doggerland's forests, massive omnivores that could weigh 800 pounds or more. They were opportunistic feeders, eating everything from berries and roots to fish, carrion, and occasionally fresh meat when they could get it. Bears probably avoided human settlements most of the time, but encounters would have been inevitable. A bear defending a kill site or protecting cubs would be absolutely deadly, and Doggerland's inhabitants would have learned to give them wide berth. Lynx prowled the dense forests, medium-sized cats that specialized in hunting deer and smaller prey. There were secretive animals, rarely seen, but their presence would have been known to any experienced hunter. Lynx kills have distinctive signatures, partially consumed deer carcasses in concealed locations, and smart hunters would have learned to recognize and sometimes appropriate these kills. But some of Doggerland's richest resources weren't on land at all. The rivers and wetlands teemed with fish. Pike lurked in the still waters, ambush predators that could reach 5 feet in length. They were relatively easy to catch with spears or traps and provided excellent meat. Archaeological sites show pike bones are among the most common fish remains, suggesting they were a dietary staple. Salmon made seasonal runs up Doggerland's rivers, just as they still do in rivers across northern Europe. These runs would have been spectacular events, rivers so thick with fish that you could practically walk across on their backs. For Doggerland's inhabitants, salmon runs meant abundance, thousands of high-fat, protein-rich fish available for the taking. Communities would have planned their seasonal movements around these events, gathering at traditional fishing sites to harvest and preserve as much as possible before the run ended. The wetlands supported enormous populations of migratory birds, ducks, geese, swans, all stopping in Doggerland during their seasonal migrations between breeding and wintering grounds. These birds provided not just meat and fat, but eggs, feathers, and down. Hunting them required specialized knowledge of behavior and migration patterns, plus technologies like nets, traps, and probably trained dogs to retrieve downed birds from the water. Along the coasts, marine resources added yet another layer of abundance. Seals hauled out on beaches and sandbanks providing meat, fat, and waterproof hide. Shellfish beds in the shallow waters offered year-round protein that required no complex technology to harvest, just knowledge of tides and locations. Fish species that lived primarily in salt water, cod, herring, flatfish, could be caught from shore or from simple boats. The North Sea has given up thousands of animal bones over the centuries, dragged up in fishing nets, exposed by erosion, discovered by divers. These bones tell us exactly which species lived in Doggerland and how they changed over time. Early deposits show more mammoth, rhino, and giant elk bones. Later deposits show increasing numbers of red deer, roe deer, and boar. The transition is clear in the physical record, and here's what made Doggerland truly exceptional as a hunting ground. The animals weren't static. They moved seasonally, following plant growth, seeking breeding grounds, responding to temperature changes. Red deer moved between summer and winter ranges. Salmon and other fish made spawning migrations. Migratory birds arrived and departed on predictable schedules. Seals hauled out at specific locations during breeding season. For human hunters who learned these patterns, who accumulated knowledge over generations and passed it down through stories and direct teaching, this predictability transformed Doggerland into something like a natural calendar. You knew when and where certain resources would be available. You could plan movements months in advance, positioning your group to take advantage of seasonal abundances. This wasn't opportunistic scavenging. This was sophisticated resource management, based on detailed ecological knowledge and multi-generational observation. As the climate continued warming and sea levels kept rising, the animal populations continued changing. Some species disappeared entirely from the region, others became more abundant. The overall productivity probably declined somewhat as the land area shrank, concentrating both animals and humans into smaller spaces, increasing competition. But for thousands of years, Doggerland remained what it had been since the ice retreated, a hunter's paradise, a landscape so rich in animal life that humans could not just survive but thrive, building complex societies based on hunting, fishing, and gathering. The animals made Doggerland possible. They were the foundation on which everything else was built. And understanding them is essential to understanding the people who depended on them for everything they had. So, here's the question that haunts every archaeologist who studies Doggerland. Who were these people? What were they like? Not as abstract statistics or theoretical populations, but as actual humans living, breathing, making decisions, raising children, falling in love, telling stories around fires on a landscape that no longer exists. The honest answer is we don't know as much as we'd like. The sea swallowed most of their world, but what we do know is extraordinary. And here's the thing. What little evidence we have tells us these weren't primitive cave people, stumbling around trying to figure out which end of a stick to use. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers with technologies and knowledge systems refined over thousands of generations. They were people who had mastered one of the richest environments in human history. Let's start with the basics. We call them Mesolithic peoples. That's archaeologists speak for Middle Stone Age, the period between the end of the last ice age around 12,000 BCE and the arrival of farming around 4,000 BCE. For Doggerland specifically, we're talking about people who lived there roughly between 12,000 and 6,500 BCE, when the rising waters finally made the place uninhabitable. But calling them Mesolithic doesn't really tell us who they were. It's like calling someone modern. Technically accurate, completely uninformative. So let's dig deeper. Based on the limited human remains and artifacts we've found, plus comparisons with contemporary cultures whose archaeology is better preserved, we can reconstruct a decent picture. These were the descendants of people who had survived the last ice age in refuges across Europe. When the ice retreated and the landscape opened up, they moved in, following the herds, tracking the rivers, mapping every resource in their expanding world. Population estimates are tricky because so much is underwater, but here's what archaeologists figure. At Doggerland's peak, around 8,000 BCE, you might have had anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 people living across the entire plain. That sounds like a lot, but spread across a landscape the size of England, it was actually pretty sparse. We're talking population densities of maybe 1 person per square mile in most areas. But here's where it gets interesting. They weren't evenly distributed. Nobody is. Humans cluster around resources, and Doggerland had resource hotspots that would have drawn people like magnets. The river valleys with their reliable water and seasonal fish runs, the coastal lagoons where shellfish beds produced tons of protein with minimal effort, the hills where flint could be quarried for tools. These places would have been packed, relatively speaking, with seasonal camps and maybe even semi-permanent settlements. The rest of the landscape, probably much emptier. Small family groups moving through on seasonal rounds, temporary camps occupied for a few weeks then abandoned, hunting territories controlled by extended kinship networks but rarely densely populated. This created what anthropologists call a fission-fusion social structure. Groups coming together when resources were abundant, splitting apart when they weren't. 20 people camping together during the salmon run, then dispersing into groups of 4 or 5 to hunt across winter territories. It's the same pattern you see in modern hunter-gatherers from the Arctic to the Amazon. It works because it's flexible, letting people concentrate where food is abundant while avoiding overexploiting any single area. But who are these people as individuals? What did they look like? What did they believe? What made them human in ways we'd recognize? Let's start with technology, because that's where the archaeological evidence is strongest. The Doggerlanders were masters of stoneworking, not the crude hand axes of their distant ancestors, but sophisticated microliths, tiny geometric stone blades smaller than your fingernail. Individually, they look almost useless. But that's missing the point entirely. Microliths weren't used alone. They were hafted, set into wooden or bone handles with plant resin adhesives to create composite tools. A row of microliths in a wooden handle made a knife with a continuously sharp edge. Stuck into a spear shaft, they created barbed points that would stick in an animal and cause massive bleeding. Arranged in a curved bone backing, they made fish hooks and harpoons. This wasn't primitive. This was modular technology, interchangeable parts, design thinking that wouldn't look out of place in a modern engineering workshop. The genius was in the flexibility. Break a blade, pop out the damaged microlith, insert a new one, keep working. Need a different tool? Rearrange the same components into a new configuration. With a handful of stone blades and the right binding techniques, you could create dozens of specialized tools. But stone was just the beginning. Bone harpoons have been found in the waters round Doggerland, barbed masterpieces designed to catch salmon and sturgeon in the rivers. These things are works of art carved with stone tools to create multiple rear-facing barbs that would prevent a speared fish from escaping. Making one required planning, patience, and deep understanding of materials. You had to select the right bone, probably red deer antler for its combination of hardness and flexibility. You had to score and groove it with flint burins, tiny chisels designed for detailed work. You had to polish and sharpen each barb, testing the balance, making sure it would fly true when thrown. Wooden implements were probably even more common, but wood rarely survives 10,000 years underwater. The few pieces we found, fishing weirs and tool handles, show the same sophisticated craftsmanship. These people knew their materials, understood grain and seasoning and the properties of different woods. They probably had specialized tools for woodworking that we'll never find because both the tools and their products have long since rotted away. The settlement patterns tell us something important about social organization. Most sites we've identified through underwater surveys look like temporary camps. Small scatters of worked flint, occasional fire-cracked rocks, nothing suggesting permanent architecture. These were probably seasonal hunting camps, fishing stations, places occupied for a few weeks or months then abandoned. But there are exceptions. Near the river mouths and in the lagoons, we find much denser concentrations of material. Heavier tools that wouldn't have been carried around, processing stones for grinding plant foods, deep deposits of ash and charcoal suggesting repeated occupation. These might have been base camps, places where larger groups gathered during resource-rich seasons, maybe even proto-settlements occupied for years at a stretch. This pattern, temporary camps scattered across the landscape with periodic aggregation at rich resource areas, is exactly what you'd expect from sophisticated hunter-gatherers. It's not random wandering, it's scheduled mobility, groups following precise annual rounds that their ancestors had refined over centuries. Spring at the salmon runs, summer in the hills hunting red deer, autumn in the nut forests gathering hazelnuts and acorns, winter in the lagoons harvesting shellfish and hunting seals. Each season had its place, its resources, its appropriate technology and social organization. But they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And thriving societies have time for things beyond mere subsistence. Art and spiritual expression in Doggerland are harder to pin down because we've found so little. The sea destroyed most organic materials, and dramatic artwork like cave paintings requires caves, which Doggerland didn't really have. But we know from contemporary cultures in Britain and across Europe that Mesolithic peoples were creating art. Carved bone implements with geometric patterns, stone beads, amber pendants traded from the Baltic, red ochre, that iron oxide pigment that humans have been obsessed with for hundreds of thousands of years, used for body paint or decorating objects. These things have been found in Mesolithic sites all around Doggerland's borders. The Doggerlanders almost certainly had similar traditions. More telling are the few human remains and associated artifacts we've found. There's evidence of careful burial practices in contemporary sites, bodies positioned intentionally, sometimes with grave goods, tools, or jewellery buried with the deceased. This isn't random. It's symbolic behaviour, suggesting beliefs about death, possibly an afterlife, definitely a sense that individuals mattered enough to be treated with ritual respect. Some burial sites show evidence of red ochre staining on bones, suggesting bodies were painted before burial. Others show placement patterns, bodies facing specific directions or positioned in ways that must have had meaning. We find animals buried with humans sometimes, dogs especially, suggesting these relationships were considered important enough to extend beyond death. What this tells us is that the Doggerlanders had complex belief systems. They thought symbolically, engaged in abstract reasoning about life and death and meaning. They probably had creation myths explaining where their people came from. They definitely had knowledge systems for tracking game, predicting weather, understanding the seasonal movements of fish and birds. This knowledge would have been encoded in stories, passed down through generations, refined and expanded over centuries. Shamanism was probably part of their spiritual life. Most hunter-gatherer societies have individuals who serve as mediators between the human and spirit worlds, using altered states of consciousness to diagnose illness, ensure hunting success, or communicate with ancestors. The Mesolithic sites around Doggerland show evidence consistent with these practices. Unusual burials, caches of seemingly ritual objects, sites that don't fit normal habitation patterns and might have been ceremonial locations. But here's what we need to understand about these people. They weren't primitive. That word doesn't mean anything useful. They had different technology than us, sure. But in terms of cognitive ability, emotional range, capacity for abstract thought, they were us. Same species, same brain size, same fundamental human experience. A Doggerland hunter knew more about his environment than any modern PhD in ecology. He could read weather from cloud patterns, track animals across different terrain types, identify hundreds of plant and animal species by sight, sound, and smell. He understood seasonal patterns, animal behavior, tidal movements, and landscape changes with a precision that would take years of graduate study to even approach today. A Doggerland woman processing plant foods knew chemistry, even if she didn't call it that. She knew which plants were poisonous and which were nutritious, how to leach toxins through repeated washing, how to ferment foods to make them more digestible, how to dry and store provisions to last through winter. This was sophisticated knowledge, technical skill refined over thousands of generations of trial and error. Their social intelligence was probably superior to ours in many ways. They had to maintain complex kinship networks across vast distances without writing or electronic communication. They had to negotiate resource sharing, arrange marriages, settle disputes, maintain alliances all through face-to-face interaction, and memorized relationship genealogies going back multiple generations. They raised children in environments where a mistake could be fatal, yet those children learned everything they needed to survive, not through formal schooling, but through observation, practice, and participation. A 10-year-old Doggerland child probably had survival skills that would put most modern adults to shame. And they did all this while maintaining their humanity. They loved, they grieved, they laughed, they told stories, they sang songs, they danced, they created art, they wondered about the world and their place in it. The archaeological record shows care for the injured and elderly, suggesting they valued individuals beyond their immediate economic contribution. It shows long-distance trade networks, suggesting curiosity about distant places and peoples. It shows innovation and experimentation, suggesting they were constantly trying to improve their lives. These weren't primitive people awaiting civilization. They were accomplished human beings who had developed a way of life perfectly adapted to their environment. They were the culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution and cultural development. They were survivors of the Ice Ages, descendants of the very first humans to return to northern Europe after the glaciers retreated. And they were about to lose everything. Because the world was changing. The ice was still melting, the seas were still rising. And Doggerland, that rich heartland they had called home for thousands of years, was slowly drowning beneath the waves. Now let's talk about what it was actually like to live there. Not the grand, sweeping narrative of rising seas and lost civilizations, but the daily grind. The actual mechanics of staying alive on the Doggerland plain. Because here's the thing about Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. They weren't just wandering aimlessly, hoping to stumble across food. They were living according to a calendar more precise than anything you'll find on your smartphone. A seasonal rhythm that had been perfected over thousands of years. Spring meant fish. Not just any fish, but massive runs of migratory species moving through Doggerland's rivers and coastal waters. Salmon, sturgeon, pike. These weren't occasional catches. These were seasonal abundances so reliable you could set your entire yearly schedule around them. Archaeological sites from similar periods show bone points and antler harpoons designed specifically for spearing large fish. These weren't simple tools. The harpoons had barbed edges carved with incredible precision, designed to penetrate and hold fast in struggling fish. Some had detachable heads connected by cords, working exactly like modern harpoons. You drive the point in, the head detaches but stays connected, and the fish can't escape. But your Doggerland ancestors weren't just standing on riverbanks hoping to get lucky with a spear. They were engineers. They built fish traps, woven barriers that funneled migrating fish into enclosures where they could be harvested by the dozens. Evidence from other Mesolithic sites shows sophisticated V-shaped wooden weirs that could last for years, directing entire spawning runs into killing zones, and nets. We know they had nets because net weights show up in archaeological contexts across Mesolithic Europe. Stone sinkers deliberately shaped and notched to hold cordage, which means they had ropes strong and consistent enough to weave into fishing nets. They were manufacturing textiles 10,000 years ago. Think about what this means for survival strategy. A single good spring fishing season could provide enough preserved fish to feed a family for months, maybe the entire year, if you knew how to store it properly. And they did. We'll get to that. Then summer arrived, and the focus shifted. This is when Doggerland would have been at its most beautiful. The wetlands exploding with life, the forests thick with new growth, and everywhere, absolutely everywhere, food. Plant foods, berries, roots, nuts, shoots, leaves, fungi. A Mesolithic forager would have known hundreds of edible species and exactly when and where to find each one. The hazelnut forests were particularly important. Hazelnuts are basically perfect survival food, high in calories, rich in fats and proteins, and unlike many wild foods, they store well. You can harvest them in autumn, and they'll last through winter without spoiling. Archaeological sites across northern Europe from this period show massive quantities of hazelnut shells, not just scattered remains, but concentrated deposits suggesting systematic harvesting and processing. Some researchers think Mesolithic people might have been managing hazelnut groves, deliberately clearing competing vegetation to encourage nut production. Not quite agriculture, but not purely wild harvesting either. Something in between. Woodland management designed to maximize food production. Women probably did most of the gathering. Not because of some rigid gender division, but because it made practical sense. Gathering requires intimate knowledge of plant species, growth patterns, and processing techniques. Knowledge that builds over lifetimes and gets passed between generations. Young girls learning from their mothers and grandmothers, building mental maps of productive locations, learning which berries are safe and which will make you violently ill. But gathering wasn't just women's work. Everybody did it. Children, elders, men between hunting trips. Because when you're living on the edge of subsistence, you don't waste food sources because of arbitrary social rules. By autumn, the focus shifted again. This is when the large mammals were at their best. Fat from summer grazing, their coats thick for winter, perfect for hunting. Deer would have been the primary target. Red deer, roe deer, maybe elk in the northern regions. But hunting these animals wasn't like modern sport hunting. This was deadly serious business. Your survival through winter might depend on successfully taking down enough large game to provide meat and hides for the dark months ahead. Hunting strategies varied depending on the prey. For individual deer, stalking was probably most common. You track the animal, get close enough for a clear shot with your bow or throwing spear, and hope your aim is true. Archaeological evidence shows these people were using sophisticated composite bows, weapons that required years to master, but could drive an arrow completely through a deer at 50 paces. The arrowheads were masterpieces of stoneworking. Microliths, tiny geometric flakes of flint set into wooden shafts with tree resin, creating projectile points that were both sharp and surprisingly durable. But for larger animals, or when a community needed more meat than individual hunting could provide, they might have used communal drives. This is harder to prove archaeologically, but it makes sense given the landscape. Drive a herd of deer toward a bog where they'll get stuck, or toward a cliff edge, or into a narrow valley where hunters are waiting. This requires coordination, planning, and probably some form of systematic communication, which means language sophisticated enough to plan complex group activities. Then winter came, and winter in Doggerland, even during the Mesolithic warm period, was no joke. Days got short, temperatures dropped, the abundant plant foods vanished, the fish runs stopped, everything became harder. This is when all that spring and summer preparation paid off. Or didn't. Shelter became critical. We don't have many preserved Mesolithic structures from Doggerland itself because it's all underwater, but we have excellent examples from similar sites across northern Europe. These weren't crude lean-tos, these were substantial buildings, wooden frameworks covered with hides, bark or turf. Archaeological sites show post holes arranged in circles or ovals, indicating structures maybe 15 to 20 feet across, large enough for extended family groups. Inside you'd have a central hearth, sleeping areas around the edges, storage spaces for tools and preserved foods. The hearth was everything, not just for warmth, though that was obviously crucial. Fire was technology. You used it for cooking, obviously, but also for tool making. Heat-treating flint to improve its flaking properties, hardening wooden spear points, straightening arrow shafts, rendering animal fats for waterproofing and adhesives, creating the charcoal you needed for the next generation of tools. A well-maintained fire was the difference between comfort and misery, maybe between survival and death. Food preservation was the art that separated groups that thrived from groups that starved. Smoking was probably the primary method for fish and meat. Build a small structure, hang strips of flesh inside, keep a smouldering fire going underneath. The smoke preserves the meat and drives off insects. Done properly, smoked fish could last for months, maybe a full year. Drying worked too, especially in the autumn when days were still relatively warm but humidity was dropping. Thin strips of meat dried on racks would keep indefinitely if you could protect them from moisture and vermin. But preservation wasn't just about meat. Those hazelnuts we talked about, they needed dry storage. Root vegetables could be cached in underground pits lined with bark or leaves. Berries could be dried or rendered into concentrated cakes mixed with fat. Every family would have had stores tucked away in their dwelling, in nearby caves, in protected outdoor caches. Your survival depended on the decisions you made in summer about how much to consume now versus how much to save for later. Get that calculation wrong, and you'd be facing starvation by February. The social dynamics of winter were probably intense. You're spending months in close quarters with the same people, maybe 15 or 20 individuals in a single dwelling, extended family most likely, multiple generations, grandparents who could no longer hunt but who carried decades of survival knowledge, parents in their prime doing the heavy work, children learning the skills they'd need to survive. This is when oral traditions flourished. Long dark nights around the fire, elders telling stories about great hunts, harsh winters survived, lessons learned from mistakes and successes. This wasn't just entertainment. This was education. The transmission of survival knowledge from one generation to the next. Tool maintenance happened during these winter months. You couldn't do much hunting or gathering in the worst weather, but you could prepare for spring, knapping new arrow points, carving bone needles for sewing hides, repairing nets and fish traps, making rope from plant fibers you'd collected during summer. Every adult would have been constantly working, hands busy even while minds might have been elsewhere, thinking about the spring to come, wondering if the stores would last, hoping the fish runs would be strong. Children learned by watching and doing, a 5-year-old helping to process hazelnuts, an 8-year-old learning to knap flint under a parent's guidance, a 12-year-old going on their first real hunt. There was no formal education because all of life was education. Every daily task was a lesson in survival skills that had been refined over thousands of generations. Family bonds were everything. In a population as sparse as Doggerland's probably was, extended family networks were literally your survival insurance. If your group faced disaster, starvation, disease, conflict, your relatives in neighbouring territories were your safety net. This is why archaeologists find similar tool styles and material culture across vast areas. Not because everyone was living together, but because they were connected by kinship networks that spanned the entire plain. But these networks required maintenance, which means people travelled, even in difficult seasons. Young adults might spend weeks walking to distant communities to find marriage partners. Trading parties would move valuable materials, high-quality flint, amber, perhaps dried fish, across hundreds of miles. These journeys were dangerous, but they were necessary to maintain the social fabric that made survival possible. And through it all, the seasons turned. Spring fishing, summer abundance, autumn preparation, winter endurance. Year after year, generation after generation for thousands of years. Your ancestors living on the Doggerland plain had perfected this cycle. They knew every plant, every animal, every stream and forest and marsh. They had adapted to their world so completely that they seemed like a permanent part of it. They had no way of knowing that beneath their feet, beneath the familiar landscape they'd inhabited for thousands of years, ancient peat deposits were compressing under the weight of ice sheets far to the north. No way of knowing that sea levels, held artificially low by the Ice Age, were beginning to rise. No way of knowing that their entire world, the hunting grounds, the fishing rivers, the hazelnut groves, all of it was about to vanish beneath the waves. The drowning was coming, and it would change everything. But nothing lasts forever. not even paradise. Around 20,000 years ago, something fundamental began to shift in Earth's climate system. The planet had been locked in the grip of the last glacial maximum for millennia. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covering Canada, Scandinavia and northern Europe. Sea levels hundreds of feet lower than today. And Doggerland, vast and fertile, stretching between Britain and mainland Europe like a bridge, like a homeland. Then the world started warming, not all at once, not in some dramatic apocalyptic event that people could see and understand and flee from. No, this was different. This was the kind of catastrophe that creeps up on you so slowly that each generation barely notices the change. The kind that transforms the world over centuries, over millennia, until one day your grandchildren's grandchildren wake up and realize that the stories the elders tell about the old lands, those aren't myths. Those are memories of a world that actually existed, a world that drowned while everyone was just trying to live their lives. Here's how it happened. Deep in the Earth's orbital mechanics, something shifted. The planet's tilt, its wobble, its elliptical dance around the sun, all of these factors aligned in a way that brought slightly more solar radiation to the northern hemisphere during summer months. Just a tiny increase, a few percentage points of additional warmth. Nothing you'd notice day to day. But ice is sensitive, especially ice that's been piled 2 miles high for tens of thousands of years. That first bit of extra summer warmth didn't melt the glaciers, it just softened them slightly, created thin layers of meltwater on the surface. But water is dark, and dark surfaces absorb more heat than white ice. So the next summer was slightly warmer at the ice surface, which created more meltwater, which absorbed more heat, which created more melting. This is what climate scientists call a positive feedback loop. Not positive in the sense of good, positive in the sense of self-reinforcing. The warming causes changes that cause more warming that causes more changes. Once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop. Over centuries, the great ice sheets that had dominated the northern world began their slow retreat. In Scandinavia, glaciers that had ground their way south through Norway and Sweden for millennia started pulling back. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet, a monster of ice covering most of Canada, began its long, slow death. In the Alps, the Pyrenees, the mountains of Asia, ice that had seemed eternal started melting into the valleys below. And all that water had to go somewhere. Sea level rise during this period wasn't uniform. It came in pulses, periods of rapid melting followed by relative stability, then more rapid melting, but averaged over millennia the rate was relentless, roughly 1 to 2 meters per century, sometimes faster during the most intense melting periods, sometimes slower during brief cooling intervals. Now 1 to 2 meters per century might not sound like much. That's about 3 to 6 feet spread across 100 years. In a single human lifetime, maybe 40 to 60 years if you were lucky, you might see the water rise by less than a meter, less than 3 feet. You wouldn't notice it day to day, maybe not even year to year. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. Sometimes it seems higher, sometimes lower. Storms push water farther inland than usual, then it retreats. How would you know that this year's high tide mark is permanently higher than your grandfather's high tide mark? How could you tell that the marsh that sometimes floods during spring rains is actually drowning, gradually becoming permanent water, rather than temporary wetland? You couldn't. Not without precise measurements. Not without written records that could compare conditions across generations, and the people of Doggerland had neither. What they had were stories. The elders talking about how when they were young you could walk to that island at low tide, how there used to be good hunting grounds where now there's only brackish marsh, how the old fishing camp had to be moved inland because the storms kept flooding it. For the first few thousand years this wasn't a crisis. It was just change, the kind of environmental shift that hunter-gatherers had been adapting to for hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, initially, the rising waters might have seemed like a blessing. As sea levels rose, the lowest lying areas of Doggerland didn't immediately flood. They became marshland. Vast new wetlands appeared where there had been dry ground, and wetlands are incredibly productive ecosystems. Reed beds provided material for building and basket weaving. The marshes attracted waterfowl in enormous numbers during migration seasons. Fish spawned in the shallow, warming waters. Eels migrated through in numbers that would seem impossible today. The people adapted. Generations of Doggerland families probably lived better because of the expanding marshlands. They developed new fishing techniques for the shallow waters. They learned which birds nested where and when. They figured out how to build structures on stilts or platforms above the seasonal flood levels. They moved their camps slightly higher, slightly farther from the advancing water, but they weren't fleeing. They were following resources, taking advantage of new opportunities. But the water kept rising. By about 12,000 years ago, the changes were becoming harder to ignore. The Doggerland Plain, once a vast unbroken expanse of dry land, was beginning to fragment. The lowest valleys were permanently flooded now, creating new inlets and bays where rivers once flowed to distant seas. The marshlands that had been productive resources were themselves drowning, becoming open water too deep for wading birds, too saline for the fish that had thrived in the brackish transition zones. The great herds that had roamed freely across Doggerland found their migration routes cut by expanding waterways. Animal populations didn't crash immediately, but they shifted, concentrated in the remaining dry lands. This might have made hunting easier in the short term, but it was a false abundance. The ecosystem was fracturing, and the people faced choices. Families that had lived in particular territories for generations, perhaps for thousands of years, found those territories shrinking. The good flint quarries were still above water, but getting to them required crossing channels that hadn't existed in their grandparents' time. The sacred groves, the burial grounds, the places thick with ancestral memory, these were being cut off by rising seas. Some groups moved east, toward what would become the Netherlands and Germany. The land was higher there, safer from the creeping waters. Others moved west to the peninsula that was slowly becoming the island of Britain. Still others stayed, adapting to an increasingly maritime existence on what remained of Doggerland. This gradual migration wasn't a dramatic exodus. It was a slow diffusion over centuries. A family decides to spend more time at their summer camp in the hills because the winter camp floods more frequently now. A generation later, the winter camp is abandoned entirely. Another generation, and the location of the old winter camp is a story the grandparents tell, describing landmarks that are now underwater, referring to places that only exist in memory and myth. Think about what this does to a culture. Your entire cosmology, your understanding of the world, is built around a landscape. That hill where the sun rises on the longest day. That river valley where your ancestors have been buried for 100 generations. That oak grove where the spirits are strong and the hunting is always good. That beach where your father taught you to read the tides and your grandfather taught him, going back to the time before memory. And it's all disappearing. Not destroyed by war or disaster, but just slowly vanishing beneath water that rises so gradually you can barely perceive it. yet so relentlessly that nothing can stop it. This psychological impact must have been profound. Every generation passing down stories about territories that were slightly more extensive than the territories they themselves knew. Every elder talking about a bigger, drier, richer world that their children would never see. It's a form of cultural trauma, this slow loss of homeland. Not the acute trauma of disaster, but the chronic trauma of watching everything you know gradually slip away. And they couldn't fight it. They couldn't build walls against the North Sea. They had no technology to hold back the rising waters. All they could do was adapt, move, and remember. By 10,000 years ago, Doggerland had transformed from a vast plain into something else entirely. A landscape of islands and marshes, channels and lagoons. The people who remained became some of the most sophisticated maritime hunter-gatherers in prehistoric Europe. They developed advanced boat-building techniques, creating watercraft capable of navigating the increasingly complex waterways. They learned to read currents and tides with precision that would rival modern mariners. They established seasonal camps on different islands, moving their entire lives according to the rhythm of the sea. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained extensive trade networks across this fragmenting landscape. Stone tools made from flint quarried on Doggerland have been found on the British mainland and in continental Europe. This means regular boat traffic, people maintaining relationships and exchange systems even as their world literally dissolved around them. But the water kept rising. Each century brought new losses. Islands that had been home to multiple family groups shrank until they could only support one, then none. Channels between islands that could once be forded at low tide became impassable straits, requiring boats even in the calmest conditions. The richest fishing grounds, the places where rivers had once met the sea, creating zones of incredible productivity. These drowned as the sea advanced up the river valleys. By 8,500 BCE, approximately 10,500 years ago, Doggerland had been reduced to a single large island, about the size of modern Wales. Archaeologists call it Dogger Island. This was what remained of the Great Plain that had once connected Britain to Europe. A final refuge for the communities that had adapted, changed and survived through thousands of years of rising seas. But even this was temporary. Even this last island was living on borrowed time. The ice sheets were still melting, the water was still rising, and something else was coming. Something that would transform this slow catastrophe into sudden disaster. The people of Dogger Island couldn't have known that the worst was yet to come. They had survived thousands of years of climate change. They had adapted to a rising sea. They had transformed their entire way of life from land-based hunter-gatherers to maritime specialists. They had maintained their culture, their trade networks, their communities through generations of loss. They were survivors, tested by millennia of environmental change. They had every reason to believe they could continue adapting, continue surviving, no matter how high the waters rose. They were wrong, because sometimes climate change doesn't just creep. Sometimes it strikes like a hammer, and when it does, even the most adapted, most resilient, most resourceful people in the world can find themselves with nowhere left to run. By 6,200 BCE, Doggerland was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, inexorably, like watching someone you love fade away over years. The vast plains that had stretched for hundreds of miles were gone. The forests where your ancestors had hunted auroch and red deer had become salt marshes. The rivers that had carved through the heartland had widened into estuaries, then bays, then open sea. What remained were islands, low-lying, marshy, constantly threatened by storms and high tides. Some were large enough to support small communities, clusters of families who had lived in this region for thousands of years and refused to abandon the land their ancestors had known. Others were barely more than sandbanks, appearing at low tide and vanishing when the waters rose. The people who still lived here weren't naive about their situation. They knew the sea was rising. They'd known for generations, watching it claim a little more territory each year. Their grandparents told stories about when you could walk to what was now an island. Their great-grandparents remembered when that island had been connected to a peninsula. Their great-great-grandparents spoke of a time when the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, all land, all home. But humans are adaptable, always have been. If your ancestors could survive 117,000 years of near extinction during the Toba bottleneck, their descendants could certainly learn to live on shrinking islands in a rising sea. They had become skilled boat builders, navigating between islands to trade, hunt, and maintain kinship networks. They had learned which areas flooded during storms and which remained dry. They had developed warning systems, ways of reading the sky and sea to predict dangerous weather. They had adapted to slow change. What they weren't prepared for was catastrophic change, and catastrophe was building hundreds of miles to the north, in waters so deep that not even their most adventurous fishermen had explored them. Off the coast of what would one day be called Norway, something was going very wrong with the continental shelf. Here's the thing about underwater geology. It's almost invisible to surface dwellers, but it shapes their world in profound ways. For thousands of years, massive quantities of sediment had been accumulating on the Norwegian continental shelf. We're talking about layers of mud, sand, and organic material hundreds of meters thick, covering an area roughly the size of Iceland. This sediment wasn't stable. It was sitting at a precarious angle on the slope between the shallow continental shelf and the deep ocean basin, and beneath it, trapped in ice-like structures called methane clathrates, were vast quantities of methane gas. As long as the temperature stayed cold and the pressure stayed high, those clathrates remained solid, helping to hold the sediment in place. But the world was warming, had been warming for thousands of years as the last ice age released its grip. Sea levels were rising, and as they rose, the pressure on the continental shelf changed. Water temperatures at depth began to increase, just slightly, just enough. The methane clathrates started becoming unstable. You know what happens when you shake a bottle of carbonated water? The dissolved gas suddenly wants to escape. Now imagine that bottle is 3,200 cubic kilometers of sediment, and the gas is methane, and the whole thing is balanced on an underwater slope. The methane began bubbling out of the sediment, reducing its density, making it more fluid. The slope was becoming less like solid ground and more like a thick slurry. It needed just one more trigger. One earthquake, one tremor, one small geological event to tip the balance. Around 6,200 BCE, it got that trigger. We don't know exactly what it was. Could have been an earthquake, fairly common in geologically active Norway. Could have been just the cumulative effect of methane release finally reaching a critical point. Could have been both. Doesn't really matter. What matters is what happened next. The sediment started to move, not all at once, not like flipping a switch, but like an avalanche. First, a small section began sliding down the slope into deeper water. That movement destabilized the sediment above it, which began sliding too. And above that, more sediment, now unsupported, started moving. within hours, possibly within minutes, an area of seafloor roughly 300 kilometers long and 100 kilometers wide was in motion, sliding down the continental slope into the deep ocean basin. 3,200 cubic kilometers of material. To put that in perspective, that's enough to bury the entire country of Iceland under 30 meters of sediment. It's roughly equivalent to the volume of Mount Everest above sea level, and all of it was suddenly rushing downhill underwater at speeds that may have reached 80 kilometers per hour. When that much material moves that fast through water, it doesn't just slide quietly to the bottom and settle. It displaces an absolutely catastrophic volume of water. The ocean surface above the slide area suddenly rose, pushed up by the moving sediment below. Then, as the sediment spread out and settled in deeper water, that raised water had nowhere to go but outward in all directions. This is how you get a tsunami. Not from the earthquake itself, but from the sudden displacement of water. And this wasn't just any tsunami. The Storegga slide, as geologists now call it, generated one of the largest tsunamis to hit European waters in the last 10,000 years. The wave propagated outward from the Norwegian coast at hundreds of kilometers per hour. In deep water, it might not have looked like much. Tsunamis in the open ocean are often barely noticeable from the surface, just a broad swell passing beneath your boat. But as the wave approached shallower coastal waters, physics took over. The same amount of energy compressed into less vertical space, which meant the wave had to grow higher. By the time it reached the Shetland Islands north of Scotland, the wave was estimated at 20 meters high. 20 meters. That's a 6-story building of water moving at highway speeds. It scoured the coastline clean, stripping away vegetation and soil, depositing sand and rocks kilometers inland. We know this because geologists have found the deposits, a distinctive layer of sand with marine shells and organisms that have no business being 20 meters above sea level. The wave hit the Scottish mainland with only slightly less force, 5 to 10 meters high by the time it reached the coast, still enough to devastate any coastal settlements. Then it kept going, sweeping south along the eastern coast of what would become Britain, and then it hit Doggerland, or what was left of Doggerland. Those low-lying islands, those marshes, those coastal settlements where people had adapted to slow sea level rise. The wave reached them within hours of the initial slide. By the time it arrived, it had lost some energy crossing deep water and shallow banks, but it was still estimated at 3 to 5 meters high. 3 to 5 meters doesn't sound like much compared to the 20-meter wave that hit Shetland. But remember what we're talking about here. These weren't rocky cliffs or elevated coastlines. These were islands that barely rose above sea level at the best of times. Marshlands where the boundary between land and sea was already blurry. Settlements built on the highest ground available, which might have been only 2 or 3 meters above normal high tide. The tsunami didn't just wash over these places, it obliterated them. Imagine you're living in one of these coastal communities. It's an ordinary day. You're maybe repairing fishing nets, or processing fish from the morning's catch, or working on a boat hull. Your children are playing nearby. Other families are going about their business, the normal rhythms of life you've known since childhood. Then someone notices something strange. The tide is going out, way out, further than it should, further than anyone's ever seen. Rocks and sandbanks that are normally underwater are suddenly exposed. Fish are flopping in pools that a moment ago were deep water. For a few minutes, maybe you're excited. Easy fish for the taking. Strange occurrence to tell stories about. Then you notice the horizon. Something's wrong with it. There's a line across the water, getting closer, getting taller, and it's moving fast, impossibly fast. By the time you realize what's happening, by the time you could shout a warning or grab your children, the wave is on you. 3 meters of water moving at 50 or 60 kilometers per hour carries the force of a freight train. It doesn't wash over you. It smashes into you, picks you up, carries you inland in a churning mass of debris, sand and seawater. If you're lucky, very lucky, you might be on high enough ground that the wave doesn't quite reach you. Or you might be far enough inland that by the time it arrives, it's been reduced to a fast-moving flood rather than a wall of water. But most people wouldn't be lucky. The archaeological record from this period is sparse, but what we have suggests significant population disruption in coastal areas around the North Sea. Settlements that had been occupied for generations show signs of sudden abandonment. The careful accumulation of material culture, tools, bones, hearth sites, just stops. We can't know exactly how many people died in the Strega tsunami. The population of Doggerland's remaining islands was probably never that large to begin with, maybe a few thousand across all the scattered communities. But percentage-wise, the losses would have been catastrophic. Entire settlements could have been wiped out in minutes. Families that had lived in the same location for hundreds of generations, gone in a single morning. And here's the cruel part. The tsunami wasn't just a one-time disaster. It was also a one-way door. Those low-lying islands that survived, that weren't completely submerged, were fundamentally changed by the wave. The tsunami deposited huge quantities of marine sediment inland, salting the soil and making it useless for the few plants people had been cultivating or managing. It redistributed sand and mud, changing coastlines, and filling in channels that boats had used to navigate between islands. More importantly, it demonstrated that these places were no longer safe. Even if you survived, even if you could rebuild your settlement, you now knew that the sea could rise up without warning and destroy everything. The psychological impact would have been immense. Your ancestors had spent generations adapting to gradual change, learning to live with rising seas, but sudden catastrophic change, that's different. That's the world telling you it's time to leave. And they did leave. Not all at once, but over the years and decades following the tsunami, the remaining populations of Doggerland's islands must have realized their position was untenable. Some probably moved to higher ground in what would become the British mainland. Others might have moved east to continental Europe. Some may have tried to stay, clinging to their ancestral lands until the rising seas finally forced them to admit defeat. Because here's what the Strega slide really did. It didn't just kill people and destroy settlements, it accelerated the final drowning of Doggerland. The tsunami redistributed massive amounts of sediment, changing the seafloor topography. Areas that had been marginally above water were now below it. Channels that had been shallow became deep. The protective barrier islands and sandbanks that had sheltered inner lagoons were washed away, exposing the remaining land to the full force of North Sea storms. Within a century or two of the tsunami, maybe even faster, the last substantial islands of Doggerland disappeared beneath the waves. Some probably persisted as tidal flats, appearing at low tide and vanishing at high tide for a few more generations. But as permanent inhabitable land they were gone. By 6000 BCE, Britain was an island. The land bridge that had connected it to continental Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, that had allowed the first humans to colonize it during the Ice Age, that had supported a unique ecosystem and culture for millennia, was submerged. The story of Doggerland as a living landscape had ended, but geological disasters have a way of preserving what they destroy. The tsunami deposits, Those layers of sand and shells laid down in minutes of violence created a time marker in the geological record. They tell us exactly when the final catastrophe occurred. And by studying them, by analysing the sediments and the microscopic organisms trapped within them, scientists can reconstruct not just when the wave hit, but how high it was, how far inland it reached, even what direction it came from. In Scotland and eastern England, these tsunami deposits are still visible today. In some places they're exposed in coastal cliffs. In others, archaeologists find them when excavating ancient settlements. Each deposit is a snapshot of the day Doggerland died, preserved in sand and silt for 8,000 years. And here's the truly sobering part. The Strega slide wasn't a unique event. It was just the most recent major underwater landslide in that region. Geological surveys show evidence of at least 3 previous massive slides in the same area over the last 500,000 years. The continental shelf is still accumulating sediment. Methane is still trapped in clathrates below the seafloor. The conditions that caused the Strega slide still exist. Could it happen again? Absolutely. Will it happen again? Almost certainly, given enough time. The only questions are when and how large. Modern Norway has developed tsunami warning systems partly because of this risk. They know they're living next to a geological time bomb that could go off with minimal warning. But 8,000 years ago, the people of Doggerland had no warning systems, no geological surveys, no way of knowing their world was built on such precarious foundations. They had adapted to slow change. They had survived the gradual drowning of their homeland. What they couldn't survive was the sudden violence of the sea rising up in a single morning and sweeping away everything they'd known. The Strega slide tsunami marked the end of Doggerland as a living landscape, but it also marked a beginning. The survivors, scattered to Britain and continental Europe, carried with them the knowledge and skills of their drowned homeland. They became the ancestors of the people who would eventually develop farming, build monuments, create the cultures we now study as ancient. They were refugees from a lost world, but they were also survivors, continuing a tradition that stretched back through the Toba bottleneck, through 1,000,000 years of human adaptation and resilience. The sea could take their land. It couldn't take their humanity, their ability to adapt, to remember, to pass knowledge to the next generation. In that sense, Doggerland never really died. It just changed form, transforming from a physical place into a memory, a genetic legacy, a cultural inheritance that shaped everything that came after. The story of human resilience, written in DNA and stone tools and archaeological sites on both sides of the North Sea, all connected by the drowned world between them. So here we are. We've followed the story of Doggerland from its peak as a thriving hunting ground to its final disappearance beneath the North Sea. But here's the thing that should keep you awake at night. This isn't just ancient history. This isn't just some interesting story about a place that vanished 8,000 years ago. Doggerland has things to teach us right now, lessons that become more urgent with every passing year. Let's start with the most obvious one, the idea of Britain as an island. When you think of British identity, when you imagine what Britain is, the island nature of the place is fundamental, right? The white cliffs of Dover, the English Channel, this sceptred isle. The very concept of Britishness is tied up with being surrounded by water, being separate from Europe, having that natural moat that shaped everything from military history to cultural psychology. But here's what Doggerland tells us. That's not ancient. That's not how it always was. For 99% of human history in that region, Britain wasn't an island at all. It was a peninsula. You could walk from what's now Newcastle to what's now Amsterdam. The Thames and the Rhine were tributaries of the same river system. The people living in what we call Britain and what we call continental Europe weren't separated by water. They were neighbours, connected by a vast plain full of resources and opportunities. The island nature of Britain, the thing that seems so permanent, so essential to the place, is actually a recent geological accident, a blip in time. For the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived there, the idea that their world would be divided by water, that their children's children would be cut off from the lands to the east, would have seemed impossible. As impossible as it would seem to a modern Londoner that their city might one day be underwater. Which brings us to the second lesson, the difference between adaptation and catastrophe. The people of Doggerland had been adapting to environmental change for thousands of years. As sea levels rose, they moved. As coastlines shifted, they shifted with them. As resources changed, they changed their hunting strategies. This was gradual enough that it probably just seemed like normal life. Generations of people living, adapting, surviving. Human beings are actually incredibly good at this kind of gradual adaptation. We're flexible, innovative, capable of adjusting to changing conditions if those changes happen slowly enough. The Doggerland people proved it. For maybe 2,000 years they successfully adapted to a world that was slowly drowning beneath them. But then came the Strega slide. Catastrophic change. Not gradual, not something you could adapt to over generations. Just sudden, overwhelming disaster. And against that, all the adaptation in the world meant nothing. You can't gradually adjust to a 25-metre wall of water travelling at hundreds of kilometres per hour. You either survive it or you don't. This distinction matters enormously today, because we're living through environmental changes that have both characteristics. Sea level rise from climate change is gradual. It's happening slowly enough that we can see it coming, measure it, adapt to it. Coastal communities can build defences, relocate infrastructure, adjust. But within that gradual change, there's always the potential for catastrophe. Storm surges, hurricanes, sudden flooding events that overwhelm defences built for normal conditions. The combination of rising baseline sea levels and increasing frequency of extreme weather events means we're facing exactly the same challenge the Doggerland people faced. Gradual change punctuated by sudden disaster. And here's the uncomfortable truth. We're not necessarily better equipped to handle it than they were. Sure, we have better technology, better warning systems, better engineering. But we also have vastly more infrastructure at risk. Vastly more people living in vulnerable coastal areas, vastly more complex systems that can fail catastrophically when stressed. Right now, today, there are millions of people living in places that might not exist in 100 years. Bangladesh, the Maldives, parts of Florida and Louisiana, major cities like Miami, New York, London, Shanghai, all facing the same slow-motion disaster that swallowed Doggerland. The difference is we know it's coming. The Doggerland people had no way to predict sea level rise, no way to understand the larger climate forces reshaping their world. We have that knowledge. The question is whether we'll use it more effectively than simply adapting until catastrophe hits. But Doggerland teaches us something else too. Something about what we lose when landscapes vanish. The drowning of Doggerland didn't just eliminate a piece of land. It severed connections between populations. It divided cultures that had been linked for millennia. It created the conditions for Britain to develop along its own distinct path, separate from the continent. Some historians argue that the very fact of being an island shaped British history in fundamental ways. The limited invasions, the strong maritime tradition, the particular flavour of British insularity. All of this stems ultimately from the drowning of Doggerland, an accident of climate and geology that happened 8,000 years ago, shaped everything that came after, from the Roman conquest to the Brexit referendum. When we lose landscapes to rising seas today, we're not just losing square kilometres of land. We're severing connections, disrupting cultures, forcing populations to move and merge and adapt in ways that will echo down through centuries. The cultural consequences of climate change aren't just about preserving traditions. They're about understanding that when landscapes vanish, they take with them entire ways of life, entire patterns of human relationship that can never be fully recovered, and we're still learning about what was lost. This is the exciting part. Doggerland isn't fully explored, not even close. It's an underwater archaeological site the size of a small country, and we've barely scratched the surface. Every year brings new discoveries, new bone harpoons pulled up in fishing nets, new sonar surveys revealing settlement patterns, new sediment cores containing pollen and seeds that tell us what plants grew there, what the environment was like, how people used the landscape. There are research projects happening right now that are revolutionizing our understanding of this lost world. Marine archaeologists using multi-beam sonar to map the ancient river valleys. Paleoclimatologists extracting cores from the seafloor to understand exactly how and when the drowning happened. Geneticists analysing DNA from the bones of Doggerland people to understand how they related to other European populations. Each discovery raises new questions. Were there major settlements we haven't found yet? Were some areas of Doggerland more densely populated than others? How did the culture of Doggerland influence the later Neolithic peoples who built Stonehenge and the other great monuments of Britain? Did refugees from the drowning of Doggerland bring new technologies, new stories, new spiritual practices to the communities that survived on higher ground? We're also learning that Doggerland wasn't unique. There were similar drowned landscapes all around the world. Sunderland in Southeast Asia, connecting what's now Indonesia, Malaysia and Borneo. Beringia in the far north, connecting Asia and North America. Sahul, linking Australia and New Guinea. All of these were exposed during the last ice age. All of them were populated. All of them are now underwater, holding archaeological treasures we're only beginning to discover. Understanding these drowned worlds is crucial for understanding human prehistory. For most of human existence, we've lived in landscapes that no longer exist above water. The archaeology of dry land only tells part of the story. The coastal areas, the river valleys, the productive lowlands where people actually chose to live, those are often underwater now. To truly understand human history, we need to explore the drowned world. But this raises ethical questions. What should we preserve? What should we study? Unlike terrestrial archaeological sites, underwater sites are incredibly expensive to excavate properly. They require specialized equipment, trained divers, complex conservation techniques. We can't excavate everything. We have to make choices. Should we focus on sites that are most threatened by trawler damage and natural erosion? Should we prioritize areas that might yield the most scientifically important finds? Should we leave some sites completely undisturbed, preserving them for future generations who might have better technology and more sophisticated questions? These aren't just academic concerns. The bones and tools and settlement remains on the floor of the North Sea are the only physical connection we have to thousands of years of human history. They're irreplaceable. Once they're gone, that history is gone forever. We have a responsibility to make thoughtful decisions about how to study and preserve this underwater heritage. There's also something profound about the sheer impermanence Doggerland represents. We think of landscapes as permanent, mountains, rivers, coastlines, These seem eternal, unchanging, the stable backdrop against which human history plays out. But Doggerland reminds us that's an illusion. Landscapes are temporary. They rise and fall. They appear and disappear. What seems solid and eternal can vanish beneath the waves in a geological eye blink. The people of Doggerland probably thought their world was permanent too. The hills and valleys they knew, the rivers they fished, the forests where they hunted. All of it felt eternal, unchanging, the way the world had always been and always would be. But it wasn't. It was just a moment, a brief configuration of land and sea that happened to last a few thousand years before vanishing forever. This should humble us. The landscapes we know, the coastlines we think of as fixed and permanent, they're just as temporary. The map of the world we carry in our heads, that seems so definite, so real. It's just one moment in an ongoing process of change. In 10,000 years, assuming humans are still around to make maps, they'll look completely different. But here's the final lesson, maybe the most important one. The story of Doggerland is ultimately a story about resilience. Yes, the land drowned. Yes, an entire landscape vanished. Yes, countless generations of people lost their homes, their territories, their connection to ancestral lands. But humanity survived. The people who fled the rising waters merged with other populations, carried their knowledge and skills and stories to new homes, adapted to new circumstances. Life continued. Culture continued. The descendants of Doggerland went on to build the great monuments of Neolithic Britain, to develop agriculture, to create new societies in new landscapes. The loss was real. The trauma was real, but it wasn't the end. It was a transformation. We're facing similar challenges now. Rising seas, changing climates, landscapes under threat. And yes, there will be losses, real, painful, irreplaceable losses. Communities will be displaced. Ways of life will end. Landscapes people love will vanish. But if we pay attention to the lessons of Doggerland, if we remember that humans have survived landscape-scale changes before, if we maintain the same flexibility and resilience and adaptability that carried our ancestors through the drowning of their world, we might find that we're tougher than we think, that we can adapt, survive, maybe even thrive in a changing world. The story of Doggerland isn't just about loss, it's about continuation, about the human capacity to keep going even when the world transforms around us, about building new homes, new communities, new lives in new places, about carrying forward the knowledge and skills and stories that matter, even when everything else changes. That's what Doggerland teaches us today. That change is inevitable, that loss is real, but that survival is possible, that humans are remarkably good at adapting to new circumstances, at finding ways forward even when the old ways are gone, that we are ultimately the descendants of people who survived the drowning of their world, and that maybe, just maybe, we have it in us to do the same. So here we are, at the end of our journey into Doggerland, a world that existed for thousands of years, supported thriving communities, witnessed births and deaths and love and loss and everything that makes us human, and then vanished beneath the waves as if it had never existed at all. But here's the thing about Doggerland. It wasn't just some footnote in European history. It wasn't just an interesting geographical quirk. For thousands of years, this was the heartland, the bridge between what we now call Britain and what we now call Europe. The fertile plain where countless generations lived and died, where children learned to track deer and identify edible plants, where elders passed down stories around fires that have been cold for 8,000 years. Think about what was lost, Not just the land itself, though, that was vast. An area larger than many modern countries, drowned and forgotten. But also the knowledge those people carried, the detailed understanding of their landscape, the generations of accumulated wisdom about which plants healed wounds, where the fish gathered in autumn, how to read weather in the flight of birds, all of it gone, preserved only in scattered fragments. A bone tool here, a harpoon point there, the ghostly outlines of ancient river valleys mapped by sonar in the North Sea. We'll never know their stories, the myths they told their children, the songs they sang, the names they gave to the rivers and hills that are now underwater forever. But we know they existed. We know they lived full, complex lives. We know they looked up at the same stars we see, felt the same sun on their faces, experienced joy and grief and wonder just as intensely as we do. And for 6,000 years they survived, through changing climates, rising seas, transforming landscapes. They adapted, moved, adjusted their strategies. They weren't passive victims of environmental change. They were active agents, making choices, finding solutions, building communities that could weather uncertainty, until they couldn't anymore, until the waters rose too high and the tsunami came and the world they knew disappeared beneath the waves. The survivors carried on, of course. They moved to higher ground, to what became Britain and the Netherlands and Denmark. They took their skills and knowledge with them. We are their descendants, carrying forward the adaptability and resilience that kept them alive through millennia of change. But sometimes, when I think about Doggerland, I can't help thinking about our own world. How the coastlines we take for granted are just as temporary as those Mesolithic shorelines. How the landscapes we consider permanent have been radically different in the past and will be radically different in the future. How the Doggerlanders probably couldn't imagine their entire world disappearing, couldn't conceive that one day, thousands of years later, trawler nets would pull up their tools from the seabed. The lesson isn't simple. It's not just climate change is real or nothing lasts forever, though both those things are true. The lesson is more subtle. It's that humans are remarkably adaptable, capable of surviving dramatic changes, but also that entire worlds can be lost, that the places we love, the landscapes we know, the homes we build, none of them are guaranteed to our children's children's children. The Doggerlanders survived as long as they could. They thrived, actually, for thousands of years in a world that was constantly shifting beneath their feet. That's worth remembering, not as a warning exactly, but as a reminder of both our resilience and our vulnerability. Thank you for joining me on this journey into deep time, for spending this time with me exploring a lost world, imagining the lives of people who walked on land that now lies beneath 100 feet of seawater. If you enjoyed this exploration of Doggerland and the forgotten world of the North Sea, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people discover these stories of vanished landscapes and lost civilizations. And I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What part of the Doggerland story resonated with you most? Did you have family stories about coastal changes, or does thinking about lost landscapes make you wonder about your own home? Leave a comment and let me know. I read them all, and I love hearing what brings people to these journeys through history. As you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe think about this. Right now, this very moment, the North Sea is rolling with waves just like it has for 8,000 years. Fishing boats cross waters that were once hunting grounds. Storm surges wash over hills where children once played. And somewhere deep below, Preserved in the mud and sand are the traces of an entire world, still there, still real, just sleeping beneath the waves, waiting for us to remember. Good night.